Chapter 14. It was at this time that I became acquainted with Herod Antipater, and with his new capital, which he had built on the shores of the Sea of Gennesaret, in the vicinity of the warm springs. My visit was official. Relations between the procurator Pontius Pilate and the tetrarch were far from satisfactory. It all began with a question of etiquette and precedence. Who had to pay the first visit to whom? The tetrarch regarded himself as a friend of the Caesar Tiberius, in whose honor he had built the city. For that matter, they all considered themselves friends of the Caesar, and they were never tired of stating the fact on their coins. Besides, he was the ruler of a country, almost a king, and he looked down on the procurator as on a Roman functionary. Pontius Pilate, on his side, simply ignored the tetrarch. Herod Antipater was a man, moreover, who had not awakened much love. He was disliked by the proconsul of Syria, Vitellius. His friendship with the Caesar was a dubious business. In reality, he was much closer to Sejanus, the emperor's powerful minister, to whom he, like all the other provincials, sent costly presents in the hope of obtaining favors. The tetrarch was a subtle and crafty Asiatic. In appearance, he would never have been taken for a Jew. There was not a trace of his people in him. The characteristically energetic Herod face, the massive skull, clean-shaven, the steel-gray Samaritan eyes, penetrating and suspicious, might have belonged instead to a Roman commander. They all wanted to look like real Romans. His arms were muscular and powerful. He drew a good bow and was an excellent javelin thrower. He had distinguished himself in the chase, had cultivated good manners, and even spoke a tolerable Latin and Greek. But all this was on the surface. His Hellenistic culture hung on him like a Roman toga on a wild German or British chieftain. Not having been destined to inherit the throne after the death of his father, Herod had not, in his youth, been sent to study in Rome like the children of Miriam. Later, however, when the older Herod had put to death Miriam's children, also his third son, whom he had originally chosen as his heir for treason, this was what occasioned Augustus's famous quip, "I would rather be a pig than a son of Herod's." The younger Herod, Antipater, who was the son of a Samaritan woman, became official heir to the throne of Galilee and Perea. But the Caesar Augustus would not let him assume the title of king. He had to be content with that of tetrarch. The god of the tetrarch, Herod Antipater, was his father, Herod the Great, whom he not only worshipped, as his brothers did too, but tried to imitate in all ways. Like the older Herod, he called himself a friend of the Senate and the Caesar, and was forever sending costly presents, squeezed out of his people, to the court and to influential senators. Neither his protestations nor his gifts convinced us. We had him carefully watched, and we were fully informed as to his secret meetings with neighboring tetrarchs and princes, for we had forbidden such gatherings. Social interchanges was what he had called them. Subsequent events justified our suspicions. We discovered in his possession an arsenal of arms and armor, but of this later. For the time being, we were content to know that he could not maintain his rule in Galilee for a single day without the support of our cohorts. He resembled or imitated his father again in his building mania, but, lacking his father's means, he could not indulge it to the same extent. However, he did not lack his father's cupidity, for he laid a crushing burden of taxation, levies, and contributions on his tetrarchate, and it was astonishing enough that he should have pressed from this inconsiderable province, which, fruitful enough to provide Judea with grain, was nevertheless of small extent, and from the sandy stretches of Perea, enough for the building of one such city as Tiberias, his new capital. With the characteristic craftiness of a barbarian, Herod Antipater played a double game. To the Jews he gave out that he was a faithful follower of the tradition, a pious observer of the Jewish law. He would not, for instance, have the image of man or beast stamped on his coinage. Like his father, he made use for this purpose only of the regular symbols of the fruitfulness of the country, ears of corn and olive trees. On the high holy days, he came up to Jerusalem according to the ancient custom. He was a frequent visitor then to the temple, and offered up in sacrifice the fattest sheep and cattle. In his interpretation of the law, he was not on the side of the enlightened Sadducees. He held with the reactionary fanatics, the Pharisaic scholars. But he compensated himself by leading, in his residence of Tiberias, the life of a genuine heathen. First of all, to ensure himself a great measure of privacy from the intrusions of his Jews, he had had his new capital built on the site of an ancient cemetery. This led the Jews, in accordance with their law, to declare the locality ritually impure so that they could not settle in it. He imported numbers of poor Greeks, Ascalonites, and Phoenicians from Tyre and Acco. They say that he even encouraged beggars and runaway slaves to settle in his capital. He brought colonists from Cyprus and Syria, gave them free allotments of land, and went so far as to build swimming baths, gymnasia, and theatres for their use. Nor did he fail to provide these with actors and gladiators from Antioch. He arranged Olympic games and offered high prizes to make it worthwhile for athletes to attend from Alexandria, Athens, and other Greek cities, and in all this he was imitating his father, Herod the Great. Last, though not least, there was the famous Temple of Augustus, of white marble and with many costly columns, which he built in honor of the former emperor. For all this, his wretched Jews had to pay through the nose. It was my honor to become acquainted during this visit with the first lady of the court, Herodias, a highly cultured and well-bred matron. Herod Antipater had taken her away from his brother, having met her on his way to Rome. The lady was ambitious, enjoyed a wide range of friendships in Rome, and was eager to obtain for her husband the title of king and larger territories at the expense of his brothers. She and her brother Agrippa had been brought up at the court of Augustus, hence her thorough acquaintance with the intrigues of all the leading families of Rome and her friendships among them. From Tiberias she maintained a copious correspondence with the capital of the empire. She exchanged letters with the Empress and with Agrippina, the daughter of Germanicus, who had begun to play a leading role in governmental circles. She introduced the Hellenistic culture into the court of the Tetrarch, surrounded herself with Greek philosophers and Roman actors and dancers, and maintained the court on a level of magnificence worthy of a great kingdom. She brought down to Tiberias Ptolemaeus, the brother of Nicolaus, to manage the business affairs of the state, to write the orations which Herod had to deliver on various occasions, and to conduct the correspondence with Rome. High Roman commanders often passed through the territory of the Tetrarch. Important officials came to collect the taxes. All of them were received at the court with open arms. They were provided with the diversion of the theatre, and they were honored by sacrifices in the temple offered to the Caesar in their presence. It was hoped that no visiting commander or official would fail to carry back to Rome or Antioch the report of this island of Greco-Roman culture in the ocean of Jewish barbarism, and of the corner of love and friendship for Rome established in this hostile and tumultuous wilderness of Galilee. I, too, as the representative of the procurator, was received in friendliest fashion. The Tetrarchess made me feel at home from the moment I crossed the threshold of her magnificent hall of columns. She took me by the arm and led me to see her superb gardens, which sloped down to the shore of the quiet, glittering Sea of Gennesaret, the fine reservoirs set like jewels among the beds of exotic flowers, and the rare and marvelous birds which flew among the foliage. Once, as we walked in the great alley of Jericho palms, which ran along the shore at the edge of her garden, she said to me, in the purest Latin, "We are, alas, too far from Rome and its treasuries of culture, but we do all that we can to maintain here, on the rim of the wilderness, the spirit of the Roman genius, the only fountain of light and happiness for human beings." She presented to me her little daughter, Salome, a child by her first husband. The young lady cannot, at that time, have been more than 9 or 10 years of age, but her appearance was already remarkable. Thick curls of hair hung in wild playfulness over the young, trembling neck and shoulders. The 2 eyes which flashed up at me were very dark, with a glimmer of brown, almost of red, which suggested ripe cherries. Her body was as supple as a serpent's, as taut as a bowstring pulled by a strong arm. She looked like a trained and disciplined boy. In brief, a characteristically Oriental beauty, unfortunately a little too Jewish, touched with Jewish exaltation and excitement, with Jewish nervous sensibility. Covered with ornaments from head to foot, her very hair weighted down with them in the Arab fashion, she gave forth a continuous tinkling as she walked. "She is a little wild still," her mother said apologetically. "Until now she has had no real upbringing. We lived with her father in the heart of the desert, and she grew up there like a wild gazelle." She fondled her daughter's locks. "From now on it will be different. We have bought for her a Greek tutor in the Tyrian market, a man educated in all the sciences and of the best Greek manners. Her education will be under the supervision of our friend Ptolemaeus. The Syliarch has no doubt met our state secretary." She paused proudly. "He is the brother of the famous Nicolaus of Damascus, who so often represented our great father Herod at the court of Augustus. I do not doubt that with his help our daughter will acquire the best in Greek culture. Before long she will have to take her place in society and play some part in affairs of state. Indeed, she will become a ruler too, for her uncle, the Tetrarch Philippus, has expressed his wish to marry her." She turned to her daughter. "As a future tetrarchess, my child, you will have to know how to mingle with people." From what I have already said, you will easily understand that we were not hampered at Herod's court by Jewish ritual and ceremonies, by Jewish restrictions on food, for instance. The kitchen was in the hands of a first-class Alexandrian cook, and then the distractions which accompanied the meals, the musicians, the men and women dancers. It was not easy to remember that I was at the court of a Jewish prince in a remote province of barbarians. At any moment I could have imagined myself back in Rome. To the music and dancing were added the sophist discourses of Ptolemaeus of Damascus. For my part, they could very well have been omitted, and I do not propose to reproduce them, for in the midst of the entertainment and the heavy drinking, they were extremely boring. I had occasion during this visit to renew acquaintance with the future Jewish king, Agrippa, who was, at the time, busily engaged in playing dice and accumulating debts. He was staying with his brother-in-law Herod, who had provided him with a lucrative post, that of overseer of the markets. I say lucrative, but we must bear in mind that not too much meat was left on the carcass after Rome and the Tetrarch had taken off their share. In any case, whatever he managed to squeeze out of the Galilean farmers and gardeners was not enough for the Jewish aristocrat Agrippa, and he was always short of money. He had surrounded himself with a large retinue and lived not like a future, but like a present ruler. His upbringing at the court had accustomed him to a life of the highest luxury, and he borrowed on every hand from his own pious countrymen and from wealthy Romans. He also applied for loans to his brother-in-law the Tetrarch, who was also his uncle, and these came, again, from the wretched peasants of Galilee. We had met before, Agrippa and I, at official celebrations in Caesarea and at Antioch. Indeed, we knew each other well. But he never recognized me. I was, it appeared, not important enough to be remembered by the Jewish prince. Then we fell foul of each other at the chariot races in the arena which Herod the Great had built near Neapolis in Samaria. The institution, with its halls and temples, was too costly for the procurator to maintain in good condition, and it was therefore beginning to fall into disrepair. But now and again, when exceptionally important visitors came from Rome and Antioch, he arranged in it athletic games, gladiatorial shows, and races in their honor. Agrippa, bored with his life at Tiberias and his post as overseer of the markets, attended every such occasion, both in order to meet with Romans and to satisfy his gambling impulses. On the occasion of which I am now speaking, I found among the charioteers entered for the contest 2 sons of the high priest, my friend Theophilus, who was extremely skillful in this branch of athletics, and his brother Mattathias. I placed my bet on Theophilus, Agrippa his against me on Mattathias, with whom he was on intimate terms of friendship. As we stood by our favorites shortly before the race, examining the impatient horses and encouraging their drivers, Agrippa suddenly raised the bet by a considerable sum of gold. I, who knew Theophilus's qualifications, was sure of his victory, but I was by no means so sure of the money which the Jewish prince was throwing with such prodigality into the race. I was bold enough to demand, instead of his word, cash. The prince took offence, the more readily, no doubt, because I had touched a weak spot. He measured me with a contemptuous glance, which asked, "Who is this man who dares to doubt my word?" He turned to one of his friends and said, "One never knows today whom one may rub shoulders with in the better circles. It used to be different. There was a time when we knew every man who was admitted." Naturally, I did not let this pass. I said, loudly enough to be heard by the group, "There used to be a time when princes of the Herodian line paid out in gold and not in dishonored notes." It need hardly be said that the bet was not placed. From that time on, the prince had better reason than my unimportance to ignore me. When his sister presented me in Tiberias, slight astonishment ruffled his boredom. He took out his emerald, applied it to his eye, looked me over from head to foot, and said, "I did not know there was a Syliarch in Jerusalem." I replied, "I have already had the pleasure of meeting you at the chariot races in the arena at Neapolis." He pretended not to remember. His sister, court-bred, at once felt the tension between us and hastened to add, "But Agrippa, this is the good commander Cornelius, the right-hand man of Pontius Pilate."